Ever feel like you're drowning in just like information overload? We were just bombarded with news and opinions and facts every single day.
It's tough to know what's true, what's just plain nonsense.
Yeah, it's really, really difficult. So today, we're diving into the world of critical thinking, which is really like your secret weapon for navigating this information overload.
Absolutely.
And we're going to be using Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies as our guide.
Great book.
And believe me, this stuff is anything but dummy level. We're talking about upgrading your mental software to think smarter, not harder.
Yeah, and what I think is so fascinating about this is that our brains are wired to take shortcuts.
Okay.
And sometimes those shortcuts, they lead us right into logical traps.
They do.
We think we're being perfectly rational when actually we're relying on hidden biases we didn't even know we had.
It's like our brains are playing tricks on us.
Yeah.
This book talks about something called the Linda problem. So imagine you hear about this woman, Linda, who's super passionate about social justice. She studied philosophy in college and has always been outspoken about her beliefs.
Okay.
Now, which is more likely? Is Linda a bank teller, or is she a bank teller who is also active in the feminist movement?
So most people would say she's a bank teller, A&D, a feminist.
Right. It just fits the picture.
It fits the picture.
Yeah.
But here's the catch. Statistically, it's far more probable that she's simply a bank teller.
Right.
There are just more bank tellers in the world than bank tellers who are also feminist activists.
Statistically.
But our brains latch onto that stereotype and make a leap without even realizing it.
Yeah, our brains really want to make that connection. It's like when we hear about a few car thefts in our neighborhood and suddenly we're convinced there's a crime wave,
Right.
even if the overall crime rate is down.
Yeah.
Our personal experiences can really skew our perception of the bigger picture. And this tendency to prioritize personal anecdotes over cold, hard data can lead to what's called an information cascade. Have you heard of this?
Oh, information cascade, for sure.
Oh,
Think of
yeah.
it like this. Someone shares an opinion based on a flimsy premise,
Okay.
but it confirms a bias you already have.
Right.
You share it with your friends, they share it with theirs, and before you know it, this shaky idea has snowballed into common knowledge,
Right.
even though it might be completely off base.
Totally, totally. And so yeah. The book gives this crazy example about the anti-fat movement, which, get this, can be traced back to a single researcher named Ansel Keys.
Okay.
And he published this paper linking heart disease to a high-fat diet, and suddenly, boom, it became dietary dogma.
And while his research was influential, the book highlights how it may have had some significant flaws,
Right.
reminding us that even seemingly groundbreaking studies need to be viewed critically and within the context of a broader body of research.
Right, and not just taken as fact, even though that's kind of what ended up happening. So if our brains are wired to make these leaps and jump to conclusions, how can we ever trust our own judgment? And this is where Daniel Kahneman's work comes in.
Right.
He basically turns traditional ideas about logic on their head.
He does. Kahneman, a Nobel Prize winner, suggests that humans aren't inherently rational beings. We're driven by emotions, biases, and mental shortcuts that often defy logic.
Okay.
And he talks about these things called hot and cold illusions.
Hot and cold illusions. Okay.
Yeah, so let's say you're faced with a big decision. A hot illusion is when our emotions cloud our judgment,
Okay.
even if we think we're being calm and rational.
Like when we make a big purchase, maybe, based on a gut feeling, rather than doing the research and weighing the pros and cons.
Exactly.
Yep.
On the flip side, cold illusion is clinging to an old belief,
Right.
even when we've learned new information that challenges it. We see this all the time with things like political ideologies or even just our taste in music. We might think our views have evolved, but often we're holding on to remnants of those old perspectives without even realizing it.
So if we're not purely logical machines, then what are we? How do we even begin to understand the way we think?
Well, the book delves into the work of Raymond Tallis, who argues that our brains are in a constant state of flux, shaped by our unique experiences and interactions with the world. He challenges the idea that the brain is simply a machine with inputs and outputs.
So it's not as simple as just feeding ourselves information and expecting a predictable, logical output?
Right. Tallis emphasizes that we're not just passive processors of data, we're active interpreters, constantly making meaning from our experiences and using them to shape our understanding of the world around us.
So if our own brains can be so unreliable, how do we navigate a world where we're constantly bombarded with messages trying to influence our thinking?
That's where understanding the power of social forces becomes absolutely crucial.
Yeah, it's like we're all swimming in this sea of influences and we don't even realize how it's shaping our perceptions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The book brings up John Kenneth Galbraith, who talked about this idea of emulation, basically, keeping up with the Joneses,
Right, right.
you know?
We've all been there. That pressure to buy the latest gadget, wear the right clothes, or even just agree with the popular opinion so we don't rock the boat.
Galbraith argued that we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, often without even being aware of it. Think about some of your seemingly personal choices.
Yeah.
The car you drive,
Okay.
the restaurants you frequent, even your political leanings. How much of that is truly driven by your independent preferences?
Right.
And how much is influenced by your desire to fit in with a particular group?
Whoa, that's a tough question to ask yourself. And then, of course, there's advertising, which is practically a science of persuasion in itself.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Advertising is incredibly effective at tapping into our emotions, often bypassing logic altogether.
Right.
And unfortunately, sometimes those tactics are used for more insidious purposes, like propaganda.
Right. And the book dives into some pretty chilling examples of propaganda, using Hitler's Mein Kampf as a case study in how language can be twisted to manipulate the masses.
Yeah, Hitler was a master of exploiting people's emotions and crafting narratives that resonated with their fears and desires.
Right.
He even went so far as to say that slogans are more effective than arguments when it comes to swaying public opinion.
Oh, wow. Which is a terrifying thought that carefully crafted slogans can be more effective than logic and reason.
Yeah,
It makes you realize how important it is to be critical of the messages we're bombarded with, especially when those messages are coming from positions of authority.
absolutely. And that brings us to another crucial point, the importance of questioning experts.
Okay.
The book talks about the BBC's struggles with impartiality on climate change, highlighting how even well-intentioned experts can present a skewed perspective.
So even if someone has a string of letters after their name or a fancy title, we shouldn't just blindly accept what they're saying.
Exactly. True critical thinking involves questioning all sources of information, regardless of their credentials. Experts can be influenced by their own biases,
Mhm.
funding sources, political pressure, all sorts of things.
Right.
We need to evaluate their claims based on the evidence they present, not just their authority.
And the book analyzes a passage from Mein Kampf, where Hitler uses a distorted view of evolution to justify his racist ideology. It's like he dressed up propaganda as science to make it more palatable.
It's a chilling example of how dangerous it can be to blindly accept information, even if it appears to be backed by science. The book shares the heartbreaking story of Lisa Catcher, a nurse who witnessed the forced sterilization of a young girl under the Nazi regime, a direct result of Hitler's twisted ideology. It's a stark reminder that ideas has consequences, and when we fail to think critically, the results can be devastating.
So we've seen how easily our brains can lead us astray, how social forces shape our thinking,
Hmm.
and how propaganda can exploit our weaknesses.
Mhm.
But it's not all doom and gloom, right? We can arm ourselves against these mental pitfalls. What are some practical tools we can use to start thinking more critically right now?
Absolutely, and this book is full of them. One really powerful concept is thinking in circles, or recursion.
Recursion. That sounds kind of
It
intense.
sounds more complicated than it is. Actually, we can borrow this idea from computer science. Recursion is about breaking down complex problems into smaller, more manageable modules, just like chapters in a book or functions in code.
Okay.
Yeah,
So instead of getting overwhelmed by the sheer size of a problem, we can break it down into smaller, bite-sized pieces.
exactly. And this approach allows for a more flexible, non-linear way of thinking. You might solve one module and realize it gives you a new insight that changes how you approach another part of the problem.
Got it.
Yeah.
So you don't necessarily have to go in a straight line. You
Yeah.
can kind of jump around.
Right.
The book also emphasizes the importance of using clear, unambiguous language.
Right. Think of it like this. If you can't explain your thought process in a way that a computer could understand, meaning it's clear and logical, then there's a good chance you haven't fully clarified your own thinking.
So it's like forcing yourself to think with absolute precision.
Exactly.
Okay.
And to organize those crystal clear thoughts, we can use visual tools like mind maps, flowcharts, and concept maps.
I've used mind maps before.
Yeah.
They're great for brainstorming and seeing the connections between ideas.
Yeah, imagine you're trying to analyze a complex project, say redesigning a public park. A mind map could help you visualize all the factors at play: traffic flow, pedestrian access, the needs of different community members, environmental concerns, and even aesthetics.
It's like creating a mental blueprint to guide your thinking.
Precisely. When it comes to absorbing information, the book is a big advocate for active reading techniques.
So no more passively skimming through articles or zoning out halfway through a chapter.
Definitely not. Active reading means engaging with the material, identifying key terms and arguments, summarizing sections in your own words, and taking notes that go beyond just regurgitating what you've read.
It's like having a conversation with the author almost,
Hmm.
challenging their ideas and pulling out the most important insights.
For sure. Now, let's shift gears from kind of individual thinking tools to navigating arguments and discussions more effectively.
Okay, so how do we take these critical thinking skills from our own heads and apply them in the real world, where things can get, I imagine, a lot messier than a neatly organized mind map?
Right. First, it's important to remember that formal logic, like what you might study in a philosophy class, and the messy reality of everyday arguments are two different beasts.
Yeah, it's like the difference between a perfectly choreographed dance and a mosh pit.
The book gives a great example. Think
Yeah.
about a common argument like, we have to reduce carbon emissions or the world will overheat. While the statement might be emotionally compelling, it's important to dissect the underlying assumptions and potential logical leaps.
Right. So how do we make sure we're not getting caught up in the emotion of an argument and overlooking flawed logic?
A good place to start is with Aristotle's three laws of thought.
Oh, right. Those were definitely covered in my philosophy class.
Right.
There's the law of identity, something is what it is. The law of non-contradiction, something can't be both true and false in the same way at the same time.
Right.
And the law of excluded middle, something must be either true or false.
You got it. And these laws may seem obvious, but they provide a framework for evaluating the validity of arguments.
Okay.
And once you're familiar with those laws, you can start looking for common logical fallacies.
Those are like little mental traps, right? Ways that arguments can be misleading, even if they sound convincing on the surface.
Exactly. The book explains the difference between deductive and inductive reasoning and how each type of reasoning plays out in our everyday lives.
Okay.
Learning to recognize these patterns helps you avoid those traps.
One fallacy that really stood out to me was affirming the consequent. It's easy to fall into that trap.
It is.
It's like saying if it's raining, then the ground is wet. The ground is wet, therefore it must be raining. But the ground could be wet for a lot of other reasons.
You're exactly right. And that's why understanding these fallacies is so important.
Right.
It helps us see through those flawed arguments and arrive at more accurate conclusions.
So we've covered a lot of ground here, from how easily our brains can be tricked to practical strategies for thinking more critically. What's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners walk away with today?
I think the book offers a powerful and encouraging reminder. The history of science is full of what were once considered cuckoo theories, ideas initially dismissed as crazy that later become accepted as truth.
Like the idea that the Earth revolves around the sun.
Exactly.
That must have sounded pretty cuckoo at the time.
Exactly. So the key takeaway is this. Never be afraid to question, to challenge assumptions, and to think outside the box. You never know what groundbreaking discoveries might be lurking just beyond the realm of conventional wisdom, and it's critical thinking that will help you get there.
Awesome. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. But this is a topic you can really sink your teeth into. So grab a copy of Critical Thinking Skills for Dummies and keep those mental gears turning.